We have a great panel, and what I would like to do is introduce Christine Farias, who is with the Department of Economics and Finance at Baruch College. She's going to moderate the panel. Professor Farias teaches economics and labor and advanced labor economics and microeconomics at the Burke-Wasserman Department of Economics and Finance here. She is an environmental economist, and main areas of interest include forestry, sustainable development, social enterprise, education, and labor issues. And she holds a PhD from Texas Tech University and has published in various academic journals. And I would like you to welcome Christine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Welcome everybody to this panel on the politics of fracking. This panel discussion will provide us with the opportunity to listen to different perspectives and become more informed about the process of drilling for natural gas using hydraulic fracturing or fracking, which in turn will help us be in action, make more informed decisions, and better choices for the future. Drilling for natural gas using fracking is a highly controversial issue facing communities across the country and many parts of the world. It is a polarizing issue here in the state of New York as well. There are currently two major perspectives on fracking. On the one hand, proponents of fracking claim that it is a cheap and safe way to tap into the vast domestic reserves of natural gas, which can make the U.S. energy independent. The extraction of this resource will, it is claimed, generate a large number of jobs, both directly and in ancillary industries. In turn, the creation of jobs and the availability of cheap energy will potentially give the domestic economy a much-needed economic boost. Proponents in the gas industry claim that the technology is safe. In addition to the positive economic outcomes, the argument is also made that energy independence will enhance U.S. security because we will be less dependent on foreign oil. On the other hand, opponents claim that fracking is not safe. Pollution and groundwater contamination from the large number of chemicals is used as a major concern. They dispute the industry claim that fracking is safe, citing a number of instances of groundwater contamination and illnesses at and near fracking sites. In addition, there are concerns about the collateral damage that fracking can cause to currently pristine areas of the country and the communities living there because of the large number of vehicles and personnel that are required to move into these areas. In sum, opponents believe that fracking has the potential for long-term, irreversible environmental damage that can impact human, plant, and animal life. So we have two sides to this issue with passionate voices on both sides. To enlighten us on these issues and the politics involved, we have today a very distinguished panel who have been deeply involved with the issues related to fracking and will provide us with a background and insight, focusing their discussion on the following questions. How fracking is being addressed in the political and policy arenas? Are the economic benefits of fracking exaggerated, while its environmental harm is understated by supporters of fracking? To what extent will fracking benefit local communities and not just entrenched interests of the mining industry? Is the potential for environmental degradation overstated by opponents of fracking? Should the decision to allow fracking be left to individual communities? If you reject fracking, what are the implications for the development of alternative sources of energy? Before I introduce the speakers for today, I would like to lay out the process that we intend to follow. After each speaker has made his or her presentation, we will begin a question and answer session for the program. And in the interest of time, we ask that you write down your questions on the index cards that are provided at your tables, and then hand them over to Mr. Matt Lapierre, right here. We also would like this to be a very productive, informative, enlightening, and educational conversation. So we ask for your cooperation in that matter. With that said, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for today, Bridget Lee. She's an associate attorney with Earthjustice, graduated from the University of Scranton, and received her JD from the New York University Law School. Before joining Earthjustice, Bridget was an associate at Sept, and Rizal, where she practiced focused on environmental law and litigation. Welcome, Bridget Lee.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Christine. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Thank you. As Christine mentioned, I'm an associate attorney at Earthjustice's Northeast office. And our office has, in recent years, been focusing a lot on the legal issues associated with the boom of gas development that we're seeing across the nation. We represent environmental and citizen groups, and I wanted to focus my discussion tonight on some of the local issues. Christine mentioned the question of whether or not fracking should be allowed should be a question of local control, and whether the benefits and the harms, how that balance plays out when we're talking about local communities. So just to get right into it, as some of my fellow panelists may argue, the economic benefits associated with gas drilling and the fracking boom may be great. The distribution of these benefits are far from equitable. And while politicians and proponents of the industry may try to pivot the discussion from those profits to job creation and economic development, what they don't want to talk about are the harms that can result, and already are resulting, from the heavy industrial operations needed to extract gas from beneath the Earth's surface. These harms can be severe and permanent, and the people, communities, and ecosystems that bear the brunt of such harms cannot be made whole by monetary compensation. As you all probably know and are familiar with, it's pretty hard to avoid the word fracking these days. Both presidential candidates have expressed support for its use, and the media has shined its spotlight on the ongoing debate that we're all part of tonight. Nevertheless, the actual process at issue is not always fully understood. I have friends who probably would consider themselves pretty well-informed citizens that, in recent months have asked me, what exactly is fracking? So just by way of background, let me talk a little bit about that process, because I think it helps to put the focus on what impacts are facing communities. So the process begins with cutting access roads through existing landscape, often intact forested land. Then several acres of land are cleared and to serve as the pad on which the wells will be drilled. Next, a drilling rig will arrive along with thousands of truckloads of equipment, water, sand, chemicals. And all of this will be used to drill thousands of feet down to the ground and then across horizontally to get at the targeted shale formation. Now, once a well is drilled, millions of gallons of water laced with various undisclosed chemicals are pumped underground at high pressure to fracture the rock and allow the gas to be released. And a percentage of those millions of gallons of water will return to the surface, creating a highly toxic waste stream. After the well is fracked, the methane gas that has been released will flow back up the wellbore, but some of it may find other pathways into aquifers or drinking water wells. The gas that is collected at the wellhead is processed and pressurized and sent through a maze of pipelines to its ultimate destination. Now, while this process may sound like a very impressive feat of technological advances, it's important to remember that fracking is a very new technology, and the science is still out on what the impacts really will mean. As a heavy industrial process, it's important to understand that the impacts associated with this technology will be those of heavy industry. And unlike other industrial operations that may come to mind, which are often separated in their own separate area, fracking is often alongside homes and schools and right in the midst of communities, which before had been perfectly happy without any industrial development. Now, turning to the impacts associated with this process, hazards emerge at every stage of the development. For example, water resources are particularly at risk. The development of a single well requires millions of gallons of water, and the withdrawal of such water may deplete aquifers or reduce stream flows in the area. The fracking process itself, which breaks apart the rock, can create subsurface pathways for both the methane gas and the chemicals that have been introduced below the surface to migrate and ultimately reach and contaminate groundwater sources. In Pennsylvania, we've already seen this happening. Methane contamination of drinking water supplies in various towns has been documented, and even in surface waters, there are reports of methane bubbling up through rivers. Other water resources may also be contaminated by the introduction of the chemicals used during the drilling and the fracking process, whether through the subsurface pathways or spills and accidents happening on the surface. The wastewater produced by this process is highly toxic. In fact, it's considered one of the most toxic industrial byproducts. And while some of that water may be reused in subsequent fracking jobs, it will eventually need treatment and permanent disposal. And the current availability of treatment facilities is just not enough to handle the estimates by industry of how much water is going to be produced. In addition to the water impacts, the air pollution caused by fracking operations can also be very severe. Sources of such air pollution include the engines that are running the equipment at the well pads, venting and flaring of the methane gas itself, methane leaks from pipelines and during the drilling process, in addition to the thousands of structures that are required to bring the water, chemicals, and equipment to the site. These emissions include, of course, methane and particulate matter, soot, ozone, and even airborne carcinogens. And while scientific studies, there have been long-term public health studies, there is evidence that exposure to these pollutants has been linked to cancer, diabetes, respiratory disease, premature death for adults, and asthma, cognitive defects, and other developmental problems for children. The New York Times has reported that in one heavily drilled area of Texas, the asthma rate for young children was 25%, which was 3 times the state average. In once pristine areas of Wyoming, air has failed to meet national ozone standards and is now dirtier than Los Angeles. So that tells us something. In addition to sort of the typical environmental resources we think of, water, air, land, fracking is having a huge impact on community character. The operations can dramatically change the landscape and, along with it, the character of the community, transforming a once quiet town into a sprawling industrial complex. The noise generated by a well, both during construction and operation, can get as loud as a jet engine, and especially during construction, may last 24 hours a day until the well is completed. Industry itself has estimated that fracking of a single well could require approximately 4,000 truck trips to get all the equipment and other necessities out there, thus resulting in constant heavy traffic through once peaceful roads, in addition to the air emissions associated with those trucks. Now, despite the severity and pervasiveness of these impacts, the oil and gas industry is largely exempt from protections of federal environmental laws. These loopholes, secured by industry's well-funded lobbyists, mean that there are inadequate baseline protections from the threats posed to the environment and public health. Current state-based regulations are variable, and often those too are inadequate to protect water and air quality and public health in communities. In Pennsylvania, for example, regulators do not even perform unannounced visits. They'll let the gas companies tell them when they should come to the site. And they leave it up to them to self-report spills, to make their own response plans, and to do their own cleanups. So, given the lobbying power that we've seen in action at the state and federal levels, local control over these operations is providing a critical line of defense for communities that are facing the impacts of fracking. Efforts to exert local control are yielding results already, and the public is becoming engaged, and there's starting to be a political counterweight to the industry's lobbying and spending. For example, California, Illinois, and New York have all allowed outright bans of gas development within municipal borders, and other states are allowing localities to place limits on where fracking operations may take place. The law in Illinois requires that gas developers obtain the official consent of any town in which they're attempting to obtain a drilling permit. In New York, just this past year, 2 court decisions upheld local zoning provisions that had banned oil and gas operations within municipal borders. The courts recognized that the challenge ordinances, which have been passed by the towns of Dryden and Middlefield, represented a valid exercise of local government's powers to regulate land use. Notably, those ordinances did not attempt to regulate any of the technical aspects of drilling, but more decided where it was appropriate for the use to take place. As of last month, the number of local communities in New York that had had enacted local laws or established moratoria of development was up to 135. And I've lost Carol now, but she just was telling me about a couple of other towns that passed those. Okay. In Colorado, where we're seeing a lot of gas development these days, and where the public support for the industry is sort of typically higher than it is in New York, communities there too are pushing for local control measures. In Ohio, municipalities have passed resolutions calling for a statewide moratorium. That's obviously still in the works. And in West Virginia, where one local fracking ban had been challenged by industry and overturned last year, the elected officials in that town are now trying to pass another zoning ordinance that will hopefully be upheld. Most recently, the Pennsylvania legislature passed a law mandating that oil and gas operations be permitted in all zoning districts, regardless of the uses, which law essentially denied localities the ability to limit or ban fracking in their borders. Now, a number of municipalities sued to challenge various provisions of that law, and at the lower court level, they were successful. And since then, the state has appealed, and that case is currently on appeal. In closing, the lack of federal controls over this industry and the inadequacy of state controls threaten to allow disastrous impacts to the environment, the communities, and the people who live in or near the areas where fracking boom is taking place. While local control over the appropriate use of land should be supported and upheld, strong uniform regulations at the federal level are necessary. At Earthjustice, we've been working on all angles of this problem. We've been lending support to local communities in their fight against industry, as well as advocating for enforceable federal safeguards, and we will continue to do so. I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Bridget. We will take questions once more. Matt. Matthew, please up here.
Put your hand up, I'll collect the question.
Our next speaker is Goldstein, Senior Attorney and New York City Environmental Director at the Natural Resource Defense Council, a national non-profit environmental organization. Eric has worked for many decades on urban environmental issues, including air pollution, solid waste, drinking water, and environmental justice. He has spearheaded public campaigns to reduce the levels of toxic lead in gasoline. He's been an advocate on behalf of recycling in New York City. He's also worked for many years to protect New York's drinking water supply, advocating for New York's watershed land acquisition program, as well as protecting more than 125,000 acres of vulnerable lands surrounding the city's upstate reservoirs. Mr. Goldstein is also a co-author of an award-winning New York environmental book, as well as published various articles on urban environmental issues. Currently also co-teaches environmental law at New York University's School of Law. Please welcome Mr. Goldstein.
Thank you very much, Christine. I grew up right here in New York City, in Brooklyn, in case you couldn't tell by my accent. And when I was a kid, we used to play stickball and punchball on the streets. Parked cars were our bases. And as we slid across the hood of the car to either catch a ball or run to the base, our hands and our shirts would come up filthy dirty with black, grimy soot. When buses or trucks would run down the street, there would be huge clouds of pollution. We would all turn away, hold our noses, look out of the way, and interrupt the game. I was probably only 10 or 11 at the time, but even then I thought, whether you live in the city, the suburb, or rural areas, whether you're rich or poor, you ought to be entitled to breathe clean air and drink clean water and have decent places to play and raise a family. And that's, I guess, a part of the motivation for why I became a lawyer and have spent my career working at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Is the most controversial and the most visible environmental issue in New York State in a couple of decades, and with very good reason. People around the state are rightly concerned that fracking gone wild will contaminate their water, pollute their air, mar their landscape, and transform their communities. And the experience of fracking in other states around the country doesn't give much comfort. Look next door to Pennsylvania just to get an example of the kinds of problems that poorly regulated fracking activities have occasioned. Or even look at Wyoming or Texas or North Dakota. Do some of the literature research and see what's going on in those states, which you traditionally think of as energy states, and you'll see that there have been some significant problems and threats to health and communities who are distressed about the pace and the activities that have gone on in the name of energy development. Meanwhile, the gas and oil industry has mocked the legitimate public health and environmental concerns that have been raised by citizens around the country. Instead, they've sought to evade a 40-year national program of environmental laws, and they've had some considerable success on that. The scope of fracking in the nation is breathtaking. Nationwide, according to national figures, to take advantage of all of the shale gas and shale oil that we now have in this country would require more than 630,000 new wells. And right here, just in New York State alone, according to the environmental impact analysis that's been done, over 30 years, as many as 56,000 wells could be drilled in the Marcellus to search for natural gas. Tonight I'll briefly summarize NRDC's concerns from an environmental and public health standpoint, explain what one of the key reasons is for why we find ourselves in this pickle that we're in, and take a moment to prognosticate as to where we think things may be heading in New York. As you might tell by my little introduction, NRDC is extremely concerned about the Cuomo administration's fracking plans. We've raised a boatload of issues and raised a considerable number of questions in filing close to 700 pages of comments from our environmental group and our colleagues and our technical experts. These questions are still unanswered and the concerns are still unaddressed. For that reason, NRDC has strongly supported a moratorium on fracking in New York State, and we continue to support and take that position and advance such legislation in the state legislature. The heart of the problem is that we're addicted to fossil fuels, and if you're ever going to end this addiction to fossil fuels and slow climate change, you're going to have to get off of fossil fuels, and that's all fossil fuels, and see that the state devotes its attention to clean energy solutions like efficiency and renewables. That's where the focus of state government action should be on now, not on developing natural gas or any other fossil fuels. Now, let me very briefly recap some of our concerns with the state's environmental statement, and of course my colleague Bridget has identified many of them already, so I'll try to race through this, trying to summarize 700 pages of comments in less than 7 minutes. One problem is water and where it's going to come from. Each time a well is fracked, it requires several million gallons of water, and each well can be fracked multiple times. Where is all that water going to come from in New York State? We don't know. Then there's the issue of contamination of local water supplies. There's a lot we don't know about the extent of contamination of local water supplies, but what we do know raises some serious concerns about methane migration and methane contamination. Industry argues there's no proven link, but take a look at what's happened in Dept, Pennsylvania, where families have had to abandon their water supplies because of methane contamination that just so happened to occur after companies started drilling in their communities, and I think you find another response. ProPublica, the independent journalism operation, has identified over 1,000 reports of water contamination near drilling sites around the United States. Even in Pennsylvania, which is a state not known for strict regulatory regimes on the issue of fracking, the state agency has fined Chesapeake and other drilling companies for contaminating water supplies and compelled them to supply drinking water to affected families. Then there's the question of air quality impacts, both from drilling operations and from the heavy traffic that would come from fracking. For these reasons, in part, areas within a half a mile of drilling sites in Colorado have experienced VOC, volatile organic compound, pollution at levels 5 times the national health standards. And it isn't just ozone. There are elevated levels of benzene, xylenes, and other organic chemicals that you wouldn't want your children to be breathing. Earlier this year, EPA published a new rule beginning to deal with some of the many concerns associated with fracking-related air pollution. They required the installation of storage tanks to store gas that would otherwise be released into the atmosphere through venting or flaring. They required compliance in this rule by October 2013. What does the industry do? They immediately went into challenge even this modest step to reduce fracking-related air pollution. They filed a petition for review, seeking, among other things, a 2-year delay in that rule. Very nice. Disposal of wastewater, another issue. The environmental impact statement here in New York State doesn't answer this critical question of what will happen to the many, many millions of gallons of wastewater that come off of every well pad. What about underground injection? That's one possible approach, but it's not appropriate in New York State due to soil conditions, and it's been linked to problems, including, as many of you have heard, small earthquakes, when that technology has been used in some other states, including Ohio. How about sending this waste to sewage treatment plants? Sewage treatment plants, they're not equipped to handle that. They were designed, that's one of the most amazing clean water advances of the last century. And these sewage plants are designed to treat biological wastes. They're not designed to treat fracking wastes. And sewage plant operators, if you speak to them confidentially, will tell you, no thanks, we don't want that fracking waste. What about specialized treatment plants specifically designed to treat these fracking wastes with all of their myriad chemicals? Well, there's not a single one such plant permitted in New York State. There's none in existence, and a waiting list for building such a facility, we haven't yet seen that. What about recycling these wastes? That's what industry always talks about. Oh, we're going to recycle these wastes. Well, first of all, what they're really talking about is recycling the flowback waters. Those are the waters that are used in the drilling process itself. But the produced waters, the waters that come up with the gas, which are much greater volumes, no one is really talking about recycling those waters, and if they are, they ought to make the commitment to recycle all of those waters, the produced waters and the flowback waters. No such commitment now in New York State. And if that weren't enough to worry about, also unanswered questions regarding radon, naturally occurring radioactive products. How much radon is in the gas? How much radon is in the water? We don't know. But a USGS survey in 2011 found that median levels of radon in the Marcellus Shale were 3 times higher than in conventional drilling operations. What would be the exposure of New York residents if we were to get radon in our gas with the short half-life that radon has? We don't know. What kinds of measures would have to be taken to limit exposures on a practical level to radon if this Marcellus Shale is taken and sent to New York City? We don't know. There are too many questions about radon that we still don't know the answer to. Overall on the health impacts, here's one thing we can conclude. There's cause for concern, and anyone who tells you that there's nothing to worry about isn't telling you the whole story. By the way, one reason why we don't know so much about this is obfuscation by industry. They claim trade secrets so they can't reveal their chemicals. They force people who have sued them to enter into non-disclosure agreements so the terms of the settlement and the extent of the pollution problems can't be revealed publicly. They get together, industry groups do, normally in competition, to fund organizations like the American Petroleum Institute and others to, in effect, advance their joint mission of getting special treatment and special status in the United States rather than be in compliance with the nation's environmental laws. This is why NRDC's guiding star when it comes to the issue of fracking in New York is the principle, the precautionary principle. This says, do no harm in effect, and before we advance anything, we're going to make damn sure that we understand the full ramifications of what they're doing, that we understand what the environmental and public health consequences are, both long and short term, and that we've taken every possible step necessary to mitigate and control those risks. And we're very far from that in New York State. Now let's turn for a moment to the economics. Here too, there are big gaps in the New York State assessment. There are major questions unanswered. Sure, they threw out some numbers about how many jobs might be created 20 or 30 years from now. It's always easy to do that in environmental studies, and almost always those job estimates are inflated. But what questions did they answer? What are the negative impacts going to be? What's going to be the impact on tourism of having hundreds, if not thousands, of wells spread throughout New York State? What's going to be the impact on farming and agriculture? What are going to be the additional health care costs to communities? The costs of additional community services, of roads, of jails. All of these costs were glossed over in the economic portion of the environmental impact statement. We still don't know the answer. So what we do know is that the environmental study in New York, at least as of now, significantly misrepresents the question of economics by not analyzing the costs of fracking, but by highlighting the potential jobs and other economic benefits that will be created. Then, just to complete the circle, let's throw out a couple of other loose ends. What about monitoring? What about enforcement? What about spill cleanup? What about bonding to cover groundwater contamination? What about independent analyses and experts to come in and supervise the program? All of those are still missing links in this state proposal. In my remaining couple of minutes, let me turn briefly to who's responsible for this and why is it that fracking has, in effect, caused all of the problems that it has around the United States and threatens to do so here in New York. Is it because they are correct on the facts? Is it because they've got widespread public support? No, the reason that fracking has advanced to the extent it has in other states and threatens to do so here in New York is the pervasive, corrosive role of money in politics. There are other reasons, but that's a key one. Historically, you can look back and see the role the oil and gas industry has played in corrupting our political process. In 2005, Vice President Cheney helped, with his colleagues, secure a loophole that exempted fracking from regulations and provisions of the Safe Drinking Water Act. That's one of 7 major federal environmental statutes that fracking is either in whole or in part exempted from. Also in that bill, by the way, that 2005 energy bill, there was a $14.5 billion provision for tax breaks for the oil, gas, coal, and nuclear industry. In 2011, this is a very quick summary, the clock is ticking, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, Shell, and the American Petroleum Institute spent $66 million in lobbying. And industry as a whole spent $150 million, according to the Center for Responsive Politics. $150 million spent in 1 year alone influencing the political process. That's why we have such a weak regulatory scheme controlling pollution from the oil and gas industry. That's why we have spills like the blowout a year ago in New Orleans. And that's why we're threatened by fracking in New York State today. Nearly 800 lobbyists circled around, in and around Washington and the state capitals from the oil and gas industry in 2011, again, according to the Center for Responsive Politics. No wonder fracking is exempt from 7 of the bedrock national environmental statutes. Where else is the fracking industry money going? To academia, when early this year the University of Texas study found there was no direct link between fracking and groundwater contamination. Where was the lead researcher from? Industry. He was on the board of a drilling company and he owned $1.6 million in company stock. But that fact wasn't disclosed when the study got huge national attention. What about the Penn State study in 2009, a major report saying that if the state put on a 5% severance tax on the industry, that the drillers would disappear from the state and take their economic funds with them. Who funded that operation? Industry did too. When SUNY Buffalo, up here in New York, did another similar story there, expansive ties between the study authors and industry. And the University of Wyoming, they've got a school of energy resources. They received over $5 million in gifts from energy companies in 2011. The list goes on and on. NRDC believes in a clean energy future, renewables, efficiency. That's where we ought to be spending our money, and if there weren't a pervasive role played by the oil and gas industry, we'd be spending a lot more money in that industry. It's not a pipe dream. In Iowa, 20% of the energy being produced today comes from wind, and it's generating not only power, but over 6,000 jobs in that state. Of course, it's not going to happen overnight. Of course, clean energy and renewables and efficiency, which is really the cheapest of all forms, can't immediately take up the entire energy load in New York State or the United States. But that's where we ought to be pushing. That's where government ought to be spending its time and its resources. And that's where New York ought to be spending its focus in the next couple of years. So what is NRDC doing? We're seeking to advance a Manhattan-level type of commitment in New York State and nationally to clean energy, to efficiency, to renewables, to wind, to solar, to hydropower. We're going to continue to press for a moratorium on fracking in New York State. And we're going to help communities around the state and around the nation adopt and defend zoning resolutions to prohibit and restrict fracking in their communities. Finally, where do we think things are going to head in New York State? Well, we're keeping our fingers crossed, but our ultimate hope is that the Cuomo administration will do the right thing. The governor has a strong environmental record. He had a strong environmental record as Attorney General. There have been major efforts to take other steps to advance sound energy policies in New York. We hope we'll do the right thing. The activists throughout the state that have been so vocal on this issue have certainly helped a great deal. And if they continue their role, and the governor continues to examine the facts, and his State Department of Environmental Conservation, remember, let's just step back. The governor came in. It was a horrible study that was done by the Patterson administration. The governor ordered a new analysis. Then there were continuing questions raised. They got close to 66,000 comments. They've taken the time they've needed to review those comments. Now, you don't see anything happening immediately because there are some significant issues raised and some unanswered questions that still aren't resolved. Many people have said there needs to be an independent health assessment. From what we read in the papers, the Cuomo administration is thinking about doing just that. So let's hope that if we continue to do our work, the Cuomo administration will do theirs and do the right thing when it comes to fracking and our energy future here in New York State. Thank you.
Thank you, Edith. Next speaker is Tom Shepstone. Tom is the owner and principal of Shepstone Management Company, a planning and research consulting firm located in northeastern Pennsylvania, where Tom shepherds development projects through the approval process, conducting market studies for major commercial and residential projects, and working with communities to evaluate projects. Recently, Tom has undertaken a consulting assignment with Energy in Dept as the campaign director for its Northeast Marcellus initiative, a grassroots effort focused on promoting natural gas development in northeastern Pennsylvania and the southern tier of New York. Tom has conducted numerous studies of property values in the two states, including analysis of the impacts of Marcellus shale development on land prices. He has also leased his own land for natural gas exploration and coordinated the leasing of other properties. Tom believes strongly in natural gas development as a tool for both economic development and open space preservation in rural areas. Please welcome Tom Shepstone.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I thought the introduction of the moderator laid out all the right questions. Looks like it's 3 against 1 here, so I'm the only one who's going to defend the fracking side of things. But I'll do so happily, because I became involved in this, as an indicated in the introduction, when I had the opportunity to lease my own land, and I realized at a certain point that this was becoming controversial, and I decided to get involved in it. I did so, and subsequently was employed by Energy in Dept to be their campaign director for the Northeast Marcellus initiative, which I'll mention in a minute. I feel very passionately about this, and I want to give you some perspective that perhaps you haven't thought about. And the first thing I want to give you some perspective on is the fact that you're sitting in a room that's probably heated either directly or indirectly by natural gas. Most of New York is. So that's the first reality that needs to sink in with everybody. It's fine to sit here and pontificate about, well, we all got to get off fossil fuels and we've got to do it just as soon as we possibly can. Tables that are made with fossil fuels. We're sitting in a room heated with fossil fuels. We're speaking in a microphone that's made from fossil fuels. We drove here, or got here in some way, with a vehicle that's run by fossil fuels. So it's time to get a little realistic here. Let me go through a little bit of background. First of all, this is the area that I cover on the right. We cover 21 counties in Pennsylvania and New York, 10 in Pennsylvania, and 11 in New York. We go from the Williamsport area in Pennsylvania up to Bradford County, which is one of the biggest drilling areas in Pennsylvania, over to Wayne County, and so on, where I live. We also, in New York State, cover from Corning up to Ithaca, over to Cooperstown, down to Monticello. So those are the areas. They're not all great drilling areas. They don't all have good gas, but they're areas that have some gas, and that's why we cover those areas. The picture on the left is a picture from Dimmick, Pennsylvania. You heard Dimmick mentioned today. You heard that it was industrialized, that it's heavy in industry, that it's been ruined. Take a look at that picture. There's a pipeline running right through that picture, and I don't think any of you can figure out where it is. And I would welcome anybody in this room, anybody who wants to go to Dimmick See me afterwards and we'll arrange a tour. We'll take you to dinner. We'll take you to any part of Pennsylvania that we've heard denigrated here today to see for yourself. See with your own eyes. I challenge you to do that. Don't rely upon what you've heard. See it for yourself, because that's the way you'll get the truth. And I would point out that that's really our mission, which is to get out the facts about natural gas. The next picture, this is a finished well pad. It only has 2 wells on it. Many of them have 6 to 8. But this is a finished one in Dimick. This is at the Elk Lake School. And if I had taken some other pictures from that day, you could have seen some students in the track meet running out beyond that. This well produced over $1 million of revenue for the Elk Lake School District. I think it was last year. Continues to produce revenue. Has allowed them to not raise taxes and to also improve their school facilities. That's critical, because rural America, rural New York, rural Pennsylvania is otherwise in deep trouble. Rural New York is losing population. School enrollments are plummeting like a rock. The construction industry is dead. And farming, as much as I love farming, and my son and my brother live on the farm that I grew up on, as much as I love it, it's nearly dead too. That's the reality. There is no economy in Western or upstate New York at all without 2 things, tourism and natural gas. And believe me, they're compatible. We've seen that in this particular area. This is the Endless Mountains area of Pennsylvania. There's been no decline in tourism in that area. We have extensive gas drilling, no decline in tourism. As a matter of fact, we've seen a lot of our tourist facilities in that area be supported on a year-round basis by activity from gas drilling activities. When you look at this finished well site, what you see is a couple of tanks, a couple of what are referred to as trees that come out of the ground where the wells are. There's a little pipeline behind this that you can't see, that's all grown up with grass. And if you stood here, you could look out, you could see a couple of other well pads, and you would say this is a very beautiful site. And it's a very important part of the community. That's the reality. Now this is another picture from Dimick. I love talking about Dimick. I love going, because Dimick, of course, is the watchword of the anti-gas movement. This is the name they love to repeat. And they love to repeat it because there were 11 litigants there who challenged a problem that existed there. And I'm not going to deny there was a bit of a problem with methane migration. They decided, rather than to take the solution that was offered to them, as several did, they decided to sue. And so it became a cause célèbre. And they essentially helped give Dimick a very bad name. However, there's now an organization you probably haven't heard of, but maybe you want to check it out on the web, called Dimick Proud. That's the people of Dimick. That's the 6,000 people that turned out at the Cabot picnic this year because they like what Cabot Oil and Gas is doing for that community. That's the reality. Not the 10 or 11 people that are suing, and most of them have now given it up after the EPA came in and found that there was no contamination, that the water was safe. This picture shows, this to me is everything. Because this is a picture, you probably can't see it too well, but you'll notice that there are 2 houses in this picture. There's a well pad in the front. This well pad produces more gas on this single well pad for Cabot than all of their 30,000 wells in West Virginia. That's how good this area is for gas. There's 2 houses here. There's an old decrepit house in the front that the landowner had falling down around his ears. And now he's building a new home behind that home. And I can tell you, since this picture was taken, he's taken down the old home. He's got a new 2-story home. It's not a McMansion. It's just a decent, common, ordinary 2-story house. That's what gas drilling has done for our area. the ability of this man to have a decent home for his community, for his family. And it's happened over and over and over and over again because of gas drilling. That's the reality for us. And I want to talk a little bit about what it means for you folks. Because the chart on the left is New York State natural gas consumption. Interesting, isn't it? This is from 2005 to 2011. It's going up. It's not going down. It's going up. You're using more gas than ever. And you know what else? Up to 90% of that comes from fracked wells. You are using more products from fracturing than anybody. Anybody. This is the biggest city in the country, the biggest consumer of natural gas. You're using more of it all the time, and most of it's from fracked wells. And you benefit by it right here in this room, sitting in this room. And if you look over on the right-hand side, you'll see a pie chart. And you'll notice that the blue, this is the New York metro area, by the way. And it talks about the sources of home heating fuels, the number of households using, in the New York City metro area, using different home heating fuels. Utility gas, 61%. Fuel oil is what, 27%. I can tell you solar is less than 1. And I'm not against solar. I'm not against wind. I work for wind companies. I've had wind companies for clients. Electricity is, what, 9%. And then there's other sources. And of course, here in the city, even though you may not directly use natural gas, you use steam. How is the steam made? The steam is made from oil or natural gas, primarily natural gas, and more natural gas all the time because the city is shifting to the cleaner burning fuel. That's the reality. And that's not all, because not only the steam is generated by natural gas, but also much of the electricity is generated by natural gas. I want you to think long and hard on those numbers. You know, it's easy. It's easy to stand up there and say, all is wrong. All the things that can happen. We can speculate, and I took notice of the two speakers talking about what may happen, what could happen, what might happen. That's very easy. That's very easy. The reality is, you're using this stuff, and we need to figure out a way to keep using it and to produce more of it. And let me just address, this is really about the politics of natural gas, and I'm not going to predict what's going to happen in New York State, but I do want to address a few issues. First of all, this idea that the distribution of the benefits is very unequitable. That somehow only landowners or oil companies are getting the benefits. In Bradford and Susquehanna counties, there was 3,600 new jobs over the last couple of years. Those are very tiny counties. One has 50,000 people, the other has 70,000 people. 3,600 new jobs for local people. Not just 3,600 jobs given to somebody else, 3,600 jobs for local people. The lowest unemployment rate in all of Pennsylvania for approximately 2 to 3 years, in a period of deep recession. Don't tell me that the benefits are unequitable. And we have an impact fee. That impact fee is collected hundreds of millions of dollars, which are distributed effectively to every Pennsylvanian because they go to community improvements and things of that sort, even environmental improvements. And I would point out that there's a lot of people in business who are getting the benefits of this, including hotel owners and motel owners and Subway sandwich shops and people who do things of that sort. These benefits are widespread. They're throughout the community. They affect every member of the community. And the cost? Well, how about the $400 million that Chesapeake Energy has paid to rebuild roads? Not necessarily after they've been damaged, but before they've used them. There's been hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars spent. And I can tell you communities that have told me, and I see it, who would not have been able to upgrade their roads at all. They were in deep trouble, wondering where's the money going to come from, had they not had the gas money to rebuild those roads, which then benefited everybody. As for some of the other things, some of the other hysteria we hear about the fact, for example, I heard today that the fracking waste, that for some reason we don't recycle produced water. That's absolute nonsense. I've been in the facilities. There's individual facilities run by various companies. Cabot is one. Cabot has a facility for treating not only the flowback, but the produced water. And they recycle it. They recycle basically 99%, and then the rest is clean enough to dispose of in an ordinary landfill as non-hazardous waste. They recycle. I didn't hear a word about closed-loop drilling. In fact, we don't put this stuff out where it comes in contact with water. It's a closed-loop system that retains it in steel tanks. Are there issues with methane migration? Yes, there are. I'm not going to deny that. They're very limited. They get a lot of attention, but they're very limited. And there's the regulations that have been approved on that have greatly reduced that problem. And in fact, I'm pleased to say New York State has had those kind of regulations for many years and has had no problem with methane migration because it's had triple casing rules for a long time. Pennsylvania now oftentimes has 4 or 5 layers of casing. So that problem is very much minimized. And I would point out that it occurs not just with gas drilling, it occurs with water well drilling. And we see, we all saw that scene in Josh Fox's movie, Gasland, the flaming faucet, which was kind of the main scene. And what we also know is that there's plenty of places in Pennsylvania and New York where you can go and light a faucet on fire where there's not a well within 50 miles. That's very common, because that is a common problem in certain parts of New York and Pennsylvania. And I also point out that we've heard all this may stuff. The EPA, which is certainly not an agency that we look to as an ally, but the EPA itself, Lisa Jackson, the administrator of the EPA, has said on more than one occasion, there is no instance, not a single one, of hydraulic fracturing polluting a water supply, and that's correct. And the various states that have regulated this have said the same thing. And that is correct. There is no instance of that happening. There is methane issues. That has nothing to do with hydraulic fracturing. That's something that can happen with drilling a water well. Is it something we should dismiss? No. It's something we need to address. And it is being addressed, and it's being addressed very effectively. So let me just say, in closing on that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. And there are a number of other things I'd like to counter, but I think it's best to do that in the discussion, questions and answers. I just want to point out that this industry is an industry that I feel very strongly about in a positive way, because it's one that has delivered to us the standard of life that we've become accustomed to. And we can all look at these charts and think about them and realize that if you want to maintain the standard of living to which you've all become accustomed, we've all become accustomed, then we've got to work together on this. You can't sit back and say, no, we're not going to do that. It's not an option. It's simply not an option. If people are realistic and want to work together, then it can happen. But it's not an option to simply say no. And that's where I'd like to leave it at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. The last speaker is Walter Hang, who is president of Toxic Targeting and an avid local activist. His firm, Toxic Targeting, compiles environmental data reports and geographic information systems, servicing individual citizens as well as non-governmental agencies. Mr. Hang has undertaken extensive research advocacy, media outreach, and public education efforts regarding proposed horizontal hydraulic fracturing activities that could impact public health and the environment in New York's Marcellus Shale formation. He initiated a campaign to require New York State Department of Environmental Conservation's Marcellus Shale draft supplemental generic environmental impact statement to be withdrawn due to numerous fundamental shortcomings, and he gained 11,000 signatories. And as a result, this effort achieved the signing of Executive Order number 41, requiring the draft to be revised by DEC, and it's still in the process. As a result, however, not a single horizontal shale gas well has ever been fractured in New York State. Please welcome Mr. Walton.
Hi, greetings. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I live in Ithaca, New York, directly over the Marcellus Shale formation, and I was running a little company and coaching hockey and trying to deal with my 3 lunatic kids, and I started hearing about Marcellus Shale. I really didn't know what it involved, and then I finally figured out that it was this vast industrialization that you've been hearing about tonight. And then I finally realized if I didn't stop it, it was going to happen. And that's exactly what I've done with your help. There is not one horizontal hydrofrac gas well in New York State, and it is due to many of the people in this room, so thank you. And the reason that we did that is because I understood the politics of the situation. And that's what we're supposed to be talking about tonight. So I'd like to basically address that at this point. So basically, until a supplemental generic environmental impact statement is adopted in final form, no hydrofracking of shale gas wells in New York State. Now that has never happened in the history of extraction mining. You go to all the other states you've been hearing about, Pennsylvania, they're like, bring it on, we're ready, go hog wild. That didn't happen in New York. And we are just trying to extend that moratorium until all of the fundamental concerns that have been raised are fully resolved. I believe fracking is the most profound environmental matter in recent New York State history, and that's how come I've worked on it every single day for the last 3 years. There are literally trillions of dollars at stake. That's why a discussion of the politics of this matter is essential. And I believe that any decision to permit fracking will be based on political considerations. So you can talk about all the technical matters, the legal matters, the economic matters, until the cows come home. The bottom line is there is one person and only one person who's going to make this decision, and that's Governor Andrew Cuomo. And there is absolutely no reason to believe that Andrew Cuomo doesn't want to permit fracking in New York State. I think he absolutely wants to do it, and I believe he hasn't been able to do it. And again, that's because of citizen pressure. So, I'm going to try to give you a little bit of perspective of actual free-floating petroleum and toxics underneath Brooklyn. So this was supposed to be investigated and remediated. It's never going to get investigated or remediated. That's just reality situation. Anyone here from southeastern Queens, where 500,000 people drink water from the ground? Well, this is the biggest report that my company, Toxics Targeting, ever generated. And it covered essentially 40% of Queens, and it identified 12,000 plus known and potential toxic sites. And the City of New York's consultants were looking for methyl tertiary butyl ether that had impacted the drinking water for those 500,000 people in southeastern Queens. And with my data, the city sued ExxonMobil, and they won $104.7 million. I wish I charged them more for the report. So Toxics Targeting is an environmental database company. I'm not a consultant, I'm not a lobbyist. All I do is compile government data. So I'm going to show you what the reality of oil and gas drilling has been in New York, and I'm going to tell you about what's been going on to prevent essentially irreparable harm from occurring. So this is an area called Allegheny, New York, and it is immediately west of Corning, New York, in the southern tier. So this is the area west of Binghamton. And as you can see, this is the area where there has been a great deal of oil and gas drilling in decades gone by. So New York State, I believe, was the site of the first gas well established in 1821. So in those days, you would literally drill down and you'd hit a pocket of pressurized gas. The gas would come up out of the well, and then after a few years, there would be no more gas. You plug the well or not plug the well, as the case may be. That's not what we're talking about with Marcellus Shale. Marcellus Shale has no pockets of gas. The gas is in these tiny little pores in the rock. And as you've heard, you got to drill down to this mile deep formation, you got to drill through the formation, and then you pump this hydraulic fracturing fluid, which has sand and slippery compounds that are added to the water typically. And if that rock is expanded about 1/4 inch, it cracks for hundreds, if not thousands of feet. Then you get that flow back, maybe 5 to 10% comes back up out of the well, and then the well begins to produce the gas. And then, along with the gas, you get that produced water, otherwise known as brine. So this is what it looks like traditionally in New York, and this is what we're going to see all over the Marcellus Shale formation if fracking is permitted. Traditionally, you either get gas and oil or you don't. If you don't get gas or oil, you don't drill anymore. But with Marcellus Shale, you got to drill every square mile because of the incredible cost of this undertaking. So what's the reality of the situation? Okay, New York State said, quote, as a result of New York's rigorous regulatory process, the types of problems reported to have occurred in states without such strong environmental laws and rigorous regulations haven't happened here. They said, all of our regs are totally great, we're fine, we're ready to go forward, we just need to tweak them a little bit. This is demonstrably not true. So beginning 3 years ago, I began to look at the Department of Environmental Conservation's own data. This is a classic case. So Dale Fox was drilling a well, and he hit crude oil and natural gas. And essentially, natural gas escaped through a fault in the shale. This is verbatim the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation's own data. And it affected properties 1.5 miles southwest on Weaver Road. So when Dale Fox hit that gas pocket, the gas went 8,000 feet in seconds. And it came blasting up these people's homes, out their wells, out of the ground. And I asked the person who called it in, Ron Lewis. I said, Mr. Lewis, how did you know your water got polluted? He said, oh, it turned black. So those people never can drink their water again. They've been compensated. And it turns out I found hundreds of these kinds of examples. Here's one involving equipment failure. One of their valves broke, causing about 100,000 gallons of brine. Brine is very toxic with heavy metals. It has radionuclides. It's very salty, and it commonly has petroleum mixed in with it. So that's a lot of contamination. It basically went into a creek, and it still doesn't meet applicable standards. So this is the bottom line. There are these enormous problems. They never get cleaned up. But the name of the game is you got to get press coverage. If there's no press, it doesn't really exist. So then Tom would say, well, you know, you're really exaggerating. There were only just a few little problems, and they, you know, really didn't amount to very much. But once I got that initial press, then what happened is people started to rat out their colleagues, and I started getting all these hilarious anonymous tips. And so once I got those tips, I got more data. I found out that most of the problems in New York State are not reported to the Department of Environmental Conservation. They're actually reported to local health authorities, like Chautauqua County Health Authorities. And so I basically got additional hundreds of problems where people's water problem reportedly impacted 12 homes in the area. Some of these people couldn't live in their homes. They had gas coming up. One guy had an 80-pound cistern cover blow off of his well. It blew like 60 feet in the air. So the idea that we haven't had contamination problems in New York is just simply not true. This is Dave Eddy, who lives in Andover and Independence, New York. So when people say we've never had a drinking water frack problem ever in the history of the country, that's just totally not true. So Dave Eddy, you can see his water well, and his water well got impacted multiple times by fracking of vertical wells, okay, in his area. And U.S. Energy basically acknowledged that they had polluted his water, and they offered to compensate him, and his home got so contaminated he had to live in a motel for a while, and they paid for it. So this is actual documentation from the company that polluted his water well in his home, offering to pay him off. He's a Mennonite, he didn't take the deal. So then I found additional contamination problems and brought them to light, and after that, the DC stopped claiming that there hadn't been problems. So this is when Governor Cuomo was running for election, and we just started bird dogging him in every community where he showed his face, and this is my little town of Ithaca. Then with the data, I got in contact with Ian Urbina of the New York Times. I beg of you, buy their newspapers every day so that people like Ian can keep writing these incredible stories. And Ian basically showed the contamination problems in Pennsylvania were absolutely unbelievable. And Ian's genius is that he can get the government's own data. So this is a PowerPoint presentation that was made to US EPA headquarters by a woman named Amy Birkdale. And this is where they basically revealed that 850,000 people near Pittsburgh couldn't drink in 2008 because it had become contaminated with so much gas drilling brine that passed through the wastewater treatment plants that Eric indicated are designed to treat biological waste. Ian also found out that there is more brine dumped into mine voids than all of the deep well injection in Pennsylvania. So they literally just pour this waste down mine voids and it drains out the bottom. Here's Dave Ferrugia. He's the only example of before and after monitoring. He's in Jamestown, New York. His water was identified to be polluted by the Chautauqua County Health Department and indicated that it was a well-documented example of drinking water impacted by gas well development. He hasn't been able to drink his water, I think, for 4 years. The DC completely turned their back on him. And their water is so bad that their veterinarians said even your dogs can't drink the water. The bottom line is that more than 22,000 people have signed a coalition letter requiring the revised draft SGIS to be withdrawn. This is the main line of attack. We're just beating on the DC, but most importantly, we're pressuring the governor each and every day, and that's how come he hasn't been able to adopt the final SGIS. NRDC, as indicated, submitted extensive 700 pages of comments, but you can see for yourself, they actually wrote extensively about a demonstration project alternative. And when you read through this, it means that you can really only allow fracking in those counties along the Pennsylvania border, Broome, Shenango, Chemung, Tioga, Steuben. And that's when you heard that the governor is thinking about actually permitting limited drilling in that area. So we had another coalition letter, we're opposing that. And so we have Matt Ryan, the mayor of Binghamton, Aaron Eaton, who's here tonight, helping us basically say, if fracking isn't safe everywhere in New York, it's not safe anywhere in New York. And we're trying to make sure that the national environmental groups don't take a face-saving bad deal and screw these communities. And that's how come we asked Eric and other members of the hydraulic fracturing panel to sign a simple pledge. Given the irreparable harm that shale gas extraction could wreak on New York's environment and public health, we request Governor Cuomo maintain the de facto moratorium until all of these problems identified in the coalition letter based on government data are fully resolved, and he refused to sign. In fact, not one member of the hydraulic fracturing panel has signed this pledge. So final note, there's Joe Martens, very lovely guy. He has no authority. He's the head of the DC. He's not going to make a decision. There's only one person who's going to make a decision, and that's the governor, and that's the reality of the politics of New York. So whenever you hear about bills being enacted in Congress, bills being enacted in the legislature, those bills are dead. They're never going to get enacted because of the politics. The House supports gas. In New York, the state Senate supports gas. In the national legislature, the U.S. Senate doesn't support it, and in New York, the Assembly doesn't support it. So no deals are going to be made, and that's how come we're waiting with bated breath on a final decision, and all of you are playing a key role in making sure that this doesn't happen until all these concerns are fully resolved. Thank you.
We're going to go ahead and take questions from the audience, questions to the panelists. But before we do that, if anybody would like to tweet, the hashtag is #fracking, capital SEN 2012. Again, #fracking, capital S, capital E, capital N 2012. Question here for Tom Shepstone. If fracking is safe, why do we need exemptions from federal environmental laws?
Well, first of all, the exemption that everybody's talking about is simply a recognition that this is a different type of thing. It really was never covered. Fracking has been around 60-some years. This is not a new process, as some would have you. And so when this was passed, I think the Senate passed it by 85 to 1. They love attaching Dick Cheney's name to it because that sends shivers up spines, I guess. But the reality is it passed the Senate by an overwhelming majority. It was a bipartisan thing. It simply recognized what had been the policy for many, many years. And I would point out that the states do have rigorous regulatory programs. And I take some offense to Pennsylvania being depicted as being a slacker on it. I don't believe they are. I do believe New York has had an exemplary program, and I think the regulations that are being proposed in the SGIS are very strenuous regulations that frankly would be difficult to comply with, but I think they set a high standard, and that's appropriate. There's nobody that doesn't want a high standard. So we're not at all concerned about being regulated. We welcome that. I think you'll find that the industry supports regulation. And in fact, I don't believe that this is in any way an under-regulated industry. If you look at the number of permits they have to obtain, the amount of time that's required to obtain those permits, and the extensive process that has to be undertaken with each and every well, I just don't see that being an issue.
Another question for any of the panelists to answer. If anybody has been to Dept, what did you see there, and how is it similar or different from what Tom describes? Anybody been to
I've
Dept?
not been.
Anybody in the audience been to Dept?
I'm on the Tompkins County Legislature in upstate New York, which I know is an area that is economically viable. We've got a $5 billion a year economy in our county, so upstate New York does have an economy. I was early on, about 3 years ago, we were faced with the reality of this project coming to our town, and the first thing that several of us did was go down to Dept and see what was this, what was it about. And what we personally observed, we were brought, anybody who takes, people should take Tom up on his offer, and you can go and you can see very nicely done drill sites and pipelines that have been covered up, but please also go to some of the citizens who will also take you on citizens tours, and what they can show you are homes with drill sites literally right outside the back window, huge ponds built into people's houses, pipelines running past their windows. The home, I saw the home of an 87-year-old woman who cannot keep with her glass dishes on her shelves because the vibration from a compressor station that was built in her backyard was so bad that she couldn't keep the glass on her shelves. And I was citing to fully ban this, we've gone ahead and also passed road protection laws, water protection. We work with other towns to learn about the ways in which they can do their site plan reviews and their driving reviews in our county. The problem for us is that it is really hard on the local level to have to reinvent the wheel in our town, in our city.
I'm terribly sorry to interrupt. Thank you for your insights. Just want to make sure everybody gets their questions, as many people as possible get their questions answered.
I would ask the panelists, please tell people in New York exactly how this would be effective for them, and also for the students at Baruch College, what are the fields that they can go into where they can impact them.
Thank you.
Another question for Mr. Goldstein. What can students and faculty do to get our government to support alternative energy, given the money lawmakers get from gas companies?
Well, we will never match the amount of political contributions that are invested by the oil and gas industry. But in politics, intensity counts for a lot. And what the environmental groups in New York State, led by the grassroots communities, have done to raise this issue now with their local elected officials and with state elected officials has definitely had an impact. And politics goes to those who participate. If you think you can have an impact and you get involved, you can have an impact. And particularly when you don't have a direct financial stake in an issue, but you're engaged because you care about your community more broadly and public health or the environment, and you make your voices heard, you can have an impact. So that's just what one could do as a citizen. You can also decide that this is an area you want to make a career in, and there are plenty of areas where you can engage either directly in the political system or indirectly in other aspects of environmental science and technology. So that's a very short answer to a complicated question.
Another question directed at compulsory integration for New York State.
I think we got there.
Well, what's the specific question?
Give us your take on compulsory integration.
Well, a compulsory integration is the legal concept that allows a majority of your neighbors to determine land use on your property. And although it strikes one as unusual, if not un-American at first, it is in fact true that if a significant portion of your neighbors agree to allow drilling on their properties, it's possible for the drillers to go under your land as well and incorporate your property or integrate your property, compulsory integration, into the drilling mix. And of course you will get some level of the proceeds if drilling is expected, but one of the reasons it is thought of by many who are concerned about fracking as such an outrageous process is it would seem to interfere with the fundamental right here in America to determine your own property use when you are protecting your property. And therefore it has been an extremely controversial practice, but one that is authorized.
Can I ask a clarification on one section that you said?
Please wait for, we'll bring the microphone around so everybody can hear you.
No, but it's been covered. You said the majority of neighbors, and it's not, it's the majority of neighbors. 60%.
Yes,
That's
correct.
different.
Would you repeat that into the microphone so everybody can
Yes, it's a majority acreage in a particular drilling area, not the number of residents. Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you, Eric. Another question for the panel. On the whole, are gas companies fair and transparent to the lessors to give them access to their land? What is the range of behavior in that regard? What is the need? range of behavior in that regard? What is it?
I probably shouldn't be the one answering it, but I'll take a stab at it. I am a landowner, and I had a good experience. I negotiated my lease before I had any association with the company. I thought it was handled reasonably well, and we formed a group, negotiated as a group. We had originally been part of a much, much bigger group, which took longer to negotiate and ended up having a much more comprehensive lease. I was very satisfied with our lease, but I think the larger group felt that they had a very comprehensive one, which was good. For me, it's been a good experience, and I say that again, not from my everyday experience, but as a landowner. Obviously, there are some companies that are going to be more aggressive than others, and they usually hand that responsibility off to a landman company. Some of those are better than others. So it depends. I do want to comment a little bit on the compulsory integration. I don't really have a position on it because in Pennsylvania it doesn't exist. New York it does. There are reasons for it, there are reasons to be against it. I would just point out that, and I think Eric stated it correctly, that it allows drilling under your land, not on your land. In other words, you can't put the drill rig up on your land if you haven't signed the lease, but you can drill under it. So that's an important clarification too. But again, I don't really have a position on it.
Question here. Do you drink your own water? Right, again, do your children drink that water? Do you worry what might happen to your health and their health over time?
That's right. Yes, of course. I've drank the water in Dimmock, as a matter of fact, and I drank it right out of the well without going through any filtering system or anything else. And that was one of the initial wells where there was some methane issues. So I have no hesitation about that whatsoever, and I would have no hesitation about drinking anybody's water, or my own, or whatever. I'm totally satisfied that it's clean, and again, I would reiterate that there's no case where hydraulic fracturing has contaminated groundwater supply. Now you can talk about the methane, and I would agree that I acknowledge at the podium that methane can be an issue. However, methane, if it's in the water, if you take a glass of it, it dissipates. So that's why it's not listed in the EPA drinking water standards. There is no drinking water standard for methane. The concern is that if it comes into let's say your well is in your basement, and that methane is leaking or coming into your basement and accumulates, it can be explosive. So you've got to make sure you vent it if that's the case. And again, that's the case with water wells as well. So that it can happen the same way. So I have no hesitancy whatsoever, and I've drank the water at Dimmock. So
Can I just make a point? So the documents I showed you this evening, they are posted publicly at toxicstargeting.com. Click on Marcellus Shale, click on dated documents. So you can see, corporate documents written to individual citizens whose water got impacted by fracking and are contaminated not with methane, but with actual toxic organic compounds, including benzene, which is a known human cancer-causing agent. The data are very, very clear. You can go through this is county health department data, the drilling company data, and so forth and so on. You can actually see checks written by Chesapeake Appalachian compensating families for installing a carbon filter to take out the contamination after their well water got impacted by adjacent fracking. It's very straightforward. It's a big problem.
I have to add two things here. One is, first of all, if you're interested in checking out Walter's data, ask me afterwards and I'll direct you to the full detailed explanation of his cases that was assembled by the DEC. Secondly, there is one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is there's a concept called presumed liability. I can speak to this more from Pennsylvania than New York. In Pennsylvania, there's a concept called presumed liability. So a gas company is automatically, regardless of the facts of the case, presumed to be liable if they're within a certain distance of a problem that occurs. That's standard procedure. It's guilty until proven innocent. That's the way it works in the law in Pennsylvania, out to a certain distance. So when you see those kinds of things that Walter's talking about, you really have to dig into it and check out the facts. And again, I would urge everybody to do that. I have no fear of the facts.
Mic check. Mic check. Mic check. Mic check.
Oh, please.
Many of us in this room belong to the grassroots organizations that have marched in Albany, marched in Trenton, marched in Philadelphia, marched in City Hall, and we've demanded a ban on fracking. Over and over again, we've demanded a ban on an unregulatable industry. And we ask, we politely and respectfully ask the green organization.
Thank you for your feedback. I know this is an emotional issue,
On demanding a ban.
but I have to say,
We ask for a
we
ban.
need to hear both sides. We need to make sure everybody has an opportunity to speak fairly. We're going to end the program at 8:15, at which time everybody's invited to stay and continue the discussion. But really, to be fair to everybody else sitting in this room, let's let the moderator lead the discussion. Thank you.
Another question here. Even though we heard that hydraulic fracking is a fairly new technology, why is there a rush to frack without fully researching the problems?
We think there is no rush. This gas has been in the ground for hundreds of thousands of years. Right now, it looks like there's a glut in the market. The prices have dropped really, really low. So just because you can drill a well or a company can drill a well, it doesn't mean that they should be doing that. And again, you know, what we've pushed for in New York State is a study of these impacts. And until the science is back on those studies, there's no reason to rush.
Question. Yeah. Why is it that we do not have a full disclosure of all chemicals that are used in fracking wells?
Well, first of all, there is disclosure. If you go to the frackfocus.org site, you'll see that the disclosure of everything that is used.
Not full.
And if you, I'll address it. And if you go to individual sites like the Halliburton site, you'll also find similar information there. All the details are there. Now, are there certain elements within that are kept back? Yes, there are. The same as there is in a bottle of Coke, for example, or that kind of thing. There always is that kind of stuff with any consumer product. However, there's two things I want to mention about that. One is that if anybody needs to have that information, they can have it, because it's a clear provision in the law, for example, in Pennsylvania, that allows any doctor, for example, who needs to know, or anybody of that nature needs to know, they can have it, and it can be disclosed to the person they're treating. That's another myth out there, and so on. The second thing I would point out is, and I would encourage you to go to the Halliburton site in particular and look at that, because I think it's a little more user-friendly. If you look at the things that are not disclosed, what you'll find, the elements, that they're very rare, but if you look at them, if you dig them out, you'll see that they're in connection with new technologies. For example, new green fracking fluids and things of that nature. You'll find that they tend to be the kind of stuff that everybody wants to see develop. And of course, those are the kinds of things where people want to protect their proprietary rights. And so that's standard procedure. It is done. But take a close look at what they are. Again, there's nothing to hide. Go in and dig it out. Look at it. Study it yourself. Ask questions. We'll be happy to provide some information on it. It's all there.
Can I just mention that the flowback and the fracking fluid, are enormously less problematic than the produced water. The brine is shockingly contaminated. It's up to 400,000 parts per million. So toxic metals, radionuclides, petroleum constituents. I mean, it's just very problematic. And in New York State, millions of gallons of that contamination are spread on roads every year for de-icing, dust control. More than 20 million gallons went to local wastewater treatment plants in Auburn, New York, and in Cuba Heights, New York, Sherburne, New York. So this idea that there's adequate regulation of this is just not true. And if fracking begins, Marcellus Shale, that output would enormously increase.
Another question, who benefits from natural gas development? We heard that communities are benefiting, but what happens when the gas runs dry in 12 years? What happens to the jobs? Are these sustainable jobs? Do they sustain lives?
I don't know where that 12-year thing came up from. I mean, the Cabot plants have been endemic for anywhere from 30 to 50 years in developing wells. So I just don't see that. That's a question that comes up quite often, and the length of the age of the well, nobody knows, of course, until we get out there how long it lasts. We do know there's a steep decline after the first year. However, that decline is proven endemic to not be nearly as steep as people projected at the outset. So that remains to be seen. Nobody knows for sure until you get out there a ways. However, the benefits to the community are very discernible. They're going to continue for some time. And I would just point out, I noticed the individual from Tompkins County mentioned Ithaca doing reasonably well, and that's true. However, it's not doing nearly as well as Williamsport, which is the same size city and is the 7th fastest growing metropolitan area in the country as a result of Marcellus Shale. We wrote an article on our blog about that, comparing the two cities. And in the last 4 years, there's been no comparison, none whatsoever. Williamsport is doing fantastic, doing better than Ithaca is doing right now as a result of Marcellus Shale.
Although I'm not familiar with those localities in detail, I just have to point out that there are many different ways of measuring quality of life. And the amount of short-term income that may come in from drilling is only one measure of happiness, satisfaction, health, and long-term viabilities of the community. Other than that, I haven't wanted to interrupt because of the adage, there's no need to shoot a man who's committing suicide. But when you say, however, there's a model of disclosure, or there's nobody that doesn't want high standards, I think that those issues speak for themselves and have warranted no response. So I'll try to, also I'm sensitive to the fact that there are 3 of us who have concerns about fracking on the panel, so I'll try to be quiet.
Well, you can be as snarky as you want, but the fact is, if we want to get into stuff like that, let's talk about the lobbying money, because you brought that issue up, and you act like that the only person that spends any, the only people who spend any money is the oil and gas industry. And I would point out that the NRDC is an $85 million enterprise, started and funded by the Rockefeller family, which is a little bit ironic. And in fact, a large part of what they do is to try to prevent development in the northern, or the southern Catskills, the Delaware portion of the Catskills, because that's where they own a great deal of land up there. So that's part of what's going on here. And I would point out the Park Foundation in Ithaca, New York, is a $315 million foundation that funds all kinds of anti-gas academic studies, including some of Howard and Graffia's study. Howard's study was a joke. Funded the Duke study, which was largely a joke. Funded a number of other really shallow, superficial studies.
Is there an anti-study that isn't a joke to you, Mr. Shepstone? Can you name one that is valid?
Well, I think actually the second Duke study had some interesting information in it, and had some good points in it. And I would even say the first Duke study had a valid point, where it said that hydraulic fracturing was not the cause of any contamination in Denver. So I accept that for sure.
Well, I'm not on the panel, so I can't.
Well, no, that's a good question.
If anybody would like to meet afterwards, I'd love to see.
Well, I just wanted to correct the record on those points. There's also the Copeland Foundation in Pittsburgh, which is $300-some million, which funds all kinds of anti-gas initiatives every year. So there's plenty of money floating around on all sides of this, and plenty of interest.
Yeah, of course, those are independent foundations and completely separate and in a different order of magnitude from the amount of money that is spent. sure. You know, the environmental community is kind of like the Democratic Party. We're not members of an organized party, we're Democrats. I think that's probably the way the environmental community operates sometimes. We haven't signed the pledge, that's a tactical decision. Let's talk about values and goals. We share the same values, we share the same desire for clean energy, we share the same goal of protecting our health and our communities and our generations to come. We all agree that the state's proposal is inadequate. We're all supporting a moratorium. So no, we haven't signed Walter's pledge, but I don't think that in the real world that amounts to a real difference of opinion as to where we all want to see the states move. And my own view is it wouldn't make much of a difference in any event.
But if it wouldn't make a difference, why can't you sign it?
Look, like I said, we don't think there's a significant difference between the two. We're not going to debate what tactical decisions we make and what others make. Everyone is free to do that. We would encourage everyone here to participate. The environmental movement is broad and diverse. If we all walk at slightly different paces, in our view, it matters less. If we're all basically walking in the same direction, we think we are. Others are free to differ and to follow and take whatever tactics they want.
And you were quoted before about how to manage suicide as well.
Another question to anyone on the panel. If the U.S. switches to alternate energy, will it lose its world power?
That's real politics. I don't understand the question exactly. Look, alternative energies are valuable. We need to be pursuing them, but we have to be careful about how we go about it. And I think the Solyndra case proved that you can throw a lot of money at this stuff. And the reality is, it's not just Solyndra. It's about the doctor. It's about
The doctor in Pennsylvania tells us the doctor poison.
Well, let me address the question I was addressing.
It's a silly question. Yeah. You're going to take everybody's time up with
It's a stupid question and bullshit answers.
You're right.
Calm down.
He's right.
Little boys, calm down.
Louder, can't hear.
Sorry, the mic was off. I apologize for that. Mr. Shepstone's been invited here on behalf of the college, on behalf of the Sustainability Practice Network. You might not agree with what he's saying, I might not, but he deserves a right to be heard. Let's let him finish his thought. We're going to close with one more question, then we'll continue the conversation. So please, Mr. Shepstone, if you would finish your point.
Well, I would just simply say, I was talking about Solyndra and the other companies, about 5 of them. And again, I'm a fan of solar energy, and I think there's a future for it, for sure. But you can't bring it on all at once. It takes time. Trying to push it is what resulted in that embarrassment. Trying to push it too hard. It's got to be done in an intelligent way. The same thing with wind. And I remind you, I've represented wind companies. I've represented communities that have approved wind projects. I stood in front of about 200 extremely angry people from down here who came to a meeting in Delaware County to oppose a wind project in a community that I was representing. So I faced the same kind of battle over wind that I faced here. This wasn't much of a battle, really, but I want you to know that. This is the problem. This is the problem we have. And we have, that's why I kept saying over and over again, the reality. We have to work together on this. That's the bottom line.
The slap suits.
Let's finish with a positive question. If we decide we're going to look at other areas beyond fracking, how can we effectively, this is to the panel, how can we effectively encourage development of what we're terming alternative energy, and so that we're not rushing too far ahead too fast, as Tom suggested. What is the right way to help encourage the growth of alternative energy? I open that to the panel.
Well, again, there are so many things to do, but we need to have, in New York State anyway, a plan that is both intensive and expansive, dealing with all aspects of alternative energy, that advances efficiency to the extent one can, recognizing that the federal government has a large role to play in encouraging greater efficiency, but there are things the state can do that provides opportunities for growth in solar, and there's solar legislation right now before the state legislature. That would be one step to take. That advances wind, that advances hydro power. I mean, if we're here to recognize we've got a real problem with our climate and we need to get off of fossil fuels, and we say that is going to be our primary energy objective in the state, there are a lot that can be done, and if the administration needs ideas from the public, I'm sure that the public could contribute with an environmental review process of alternative energy steps that could be taken, and we can really get growing. And what should happen is that New York should be the national leader. Why does it always have to be California? New York should be the national leader in clean energy.
One of the things that could be done by New York on wind is to provide less, and I believe it's happening already, provide less discretion by local communities in the permitting process. I know a lot of you don't want to hear that, but that's the reality. If you want to get it done, if you want to get some of these projects done, you're going to have to streamline the approval process, and that should happen with wind. It should, and it hasn't happened yet. And that's one of the concrete things that can be done.
Several of us in this room met with Bobby Kennedy in the springtime, and one of the observations that he made was that with natural gas at the shockingly low pricing levels that we're currently looking at, that there is simply no way that wind and solar and a lot of the other sustainable alternatives can compete financially. And so if fracking is permitted in New York State, that's going to result in an investment that's really going to have like a 50-year amortization. So we are at an absolutely critical moment. Once we go down the path of fracking in New York State, you can pretty much kiss goodbye a lot of the alternatives. And that's how come, that's a very, very important component of this discussion. But again, it all hinges on one person with regard to one decision. So you can have all the hopes and dreams you want, but they're very hard to achieve.
Thank you. But on that note, we'd like to end. We want to thank you for participating in this discussion. We want to think about the marginal benefits and the marginal costs of this action of hydraulic fracking. There's lots of benefits and costs that we've been talking about, but what are the hidden benefits and hidden costs are some things that we cannot measure. And with that, I'd like to thank the panelists.
I'd like to remind everybody there is food, a glass of wine, and some tea. Any of the conversation.